So Tu B'Shvat actually is part of a family of holidays that are de-emphasized by Rabbinic Judaism, but may have played a very large role in earlier phases of the evolution of Jewish religion. They're generally understood as fertility festivals. Now you can understand why the rabbis might have de-emphasized those, because often fertility festivals are connected to fertility goddesses, and fertility rituals and rites and, a reenactment of procreation that don't fit in the austere ethos of much of Rabbinic Judaism. I mean, Purim is sort of a let everything go holiday, but that's the exception to the rule, and the other holidays, they want to really try to keep it under control, or at least under better control. In terms of the earlier roots, remember we talked in our earlier holidays about a harvest layer, a Torah layer. Well, Hanukkah doesn't have those because it wasn't there. And the same is true for these holidays. It's mostly suppressed, not mentioned. But there are a few echoes where it pops up here and there. And so I'm going to share a document with you that has some of those primary sources that talk a little bit about this holiday. So the first time we see Tu B'Shvat mentioned explicitly is in the Mishnah, this collection of rabbinic sayings. Let me just do one thing. Sorry. Okay. As I mentioned, the first time we see this is in the Mishnah, where it's beginning to talk about Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, but it mentions that there are actually 4 New Years in the Jewish calendar. The first of Nisan is the New Year for kings and the New Year's for festivals. Remember, in Leviticus 23, Passover is in the first month. Okay? So the New Year for counting festivals is in the spring, and that's why even the rabbis admit that that's one version of a new year. The first of Elul, which is in the summer, is a new year for animals, because who wants to keep track of all the animal birthdays? But if you need to know when a horse is 2 years old or 3 years old, you got to pick a date. My understanding is that all horses are marked by the year they're born, not by the date they're born. So January 1st, every horse becomes a year older. Because again, keeping track of all the horse birthdays would be complicated. The first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashanah for years and for counting and for planting. So if you're counting, let's say, is this a year where I have to leave the field empty because it's a 7th year, a Jubilee year, or a 50th year, Jubilee year? 7th year is a year for Shemitah, leaving it empty, and the 50th year is a Jubilee year. Well, you use the first of Tishrei to mark the beginning of that year, and of course that is the current date of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, according to the rabbis. And the first of Shavat is the New Year for trees, according to the school of Shammai, but the school of Hillel says the 15th of Shavat. Okay, so again, school of Shammai often loses, Hillel wins most of the time, and in this case, Hillel says the 15th of Shavat, the New Year for trees, should be the date. Now, remember, the 15th of a Jewish month is a full moon. And trees are often symbols for fertility. Whether you think of the phallic nature of them or you think of the fruit that is born from them, certainly fruit trees would be a wonderful symbol for fertility because they keep producing and producing and producing. And so the juxtaposition of a full moon, and the moon as well might be a sign of fertility because of women's monthly cycles. Well, you combine the moon, you combine the trees. Maybe this is an echo of an earlier holiday that had to do with planting trees or marking fertility at the time of the full moon. Now, I will make one comment about the name of the holiday. Shavat is the name of the month. B means in or of. So 2 is actually the number 15. But it's not the number 15 like you would normally write it, because in Hebrew, each letter is a number. So Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, and so on. The number 5 is Hey, and the number 10 is Yud. But you wouldn't write Yud Hey, because that's part of the name of God. So you wouldn't call it Yah b'Shavat, because that's part of God's name. So instead, they take 6 and 9. So you get a Tet and a Vav, and that makes 6 plus 9 is 15, so it's called Tu B'Shvat because it's the 15th, but you can't say Yah b'Shvat, that's too close to God's name. So we're stuck with the pious substitute. Now, I'll give you an example of a text that does talk about that fertility ritual as, again, a pre-echo of what may be being preserved of that earlier fertility goddess worship. So here in 2 Kings chapter 23, King Josiah has collected all the people with him, and he reads to them the book of the covenant, and they commit to following the rules of the covenant as best they can with all their heart, with all their soul. That kind of rhetoric, by the way, sounds a bit like the book of Deuteronomy, and many scholars speculate that the book that Josiah claims to have found here was in fact some version of Deuteronomy. The people stood to the covenant. Here's the underlined part. The king commanded Hilkiah the high priest, the priest of the second order, the gatekeepers, to bring out from the temple of Yahweh all the utensils made for Baal and for the Asherah. Now Asherah we know is a Canaanite fertility goddess. And for all the host of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron. So they were made of something that was burnable, possibly even wood. He carried their ashes to Bethel. He deposed idolatrous priests. And then in the next underlined passage, he brought out the Asherah from the house of Yahweh outside Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, and burned it at the brook Kidron, and stamped it small to dust, and cast its dust upon the graves of the common people. Whew! That's some antagonism there. He also broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes that were by the house of Yahweh, where the women wove covering for the Asherah. So the Asherah was clearly a very important piece in the temple for many years, centuries even, where the women wore coverings for it, and there were male cult prostitutes there for fertility rituals, and this was a central item in the temple that he, in his Reformation, is going to take out and destroy and make it totally trafe by putting it on the graves, not just the graves of noble people, graves of the common people. I mean, how patronizing and insulting can you get? And he also takes down the high places that were there. He breaks in pieces the images, cut down the Asherim. So evidently there were these Asherah poles all over the place that people had planted or set in place as fertility rites. And here he's defiling them all, cutting them down and filling their places with the bones of men, because the bones are defiling. And he also takes away the high place at Bethel, and where Jeroboam had made Israel sin. He stamped that to small powder, and he burned again the Asherah that could be found there. So here we have a very strong antagonism to this fertility ritual that, again, you find no echo of in rabbinic literature because it's been so suppressed. Even by, I mean, if it was suppressed by the people who were writing the Torah in 600 BCE, by the time of the rabbis, it's really been stamped out. I mean, you even find, dating back to the time of King Josiah, a trove of idols of a fertility goddess with large breasts and clearly someone who could be pregnant, and they're intentionally broken and thrown into a garbage dump. So this Reformation actually has some historical basis to it. It's not just a source in the Bible. We have archaeological confirmation of the expelling of this fertility cult. And there's even a famous passage in the book of Jeremiah, we don't have time for tonight, where the women say, we're going to keep worshiping the Queen of Heaven, no matter what you say, prophet. And Jeremiah says, no, that's terrible. You're going to cause Yahweh to get even more mad. And they say, you're wrong. When we worshipped her, everything was fine. We stopped worshiping her. She got mad, and look what happened to us. We got destroyed. So, you could read the same evidence in different ways. But that, again, reflects that this was a common popular practice to have these fertility goddesses that was eventually stamped out in Jewish life. And the echoes might remain with planting trees this time of year and having a new year for trees that's separate from the new year for planting. I mean, in theory, why not just count the new year for trees with the new year for planting? Well, we also note that in the climate in Israel, Tu B'Shvat, which happens at the end of January, beginning of February, is actually the beginning of trees' leaves beginning to return or buds to flower again. In Chicago, it's not. We talk about spring is here, and it's absurd because it's snowing and cold out. But in Israel, it makes sense because the trees are beginning to flower again. Now, Tu B'Shvat languish is a very, very minor holiday where you had some fruits and maybe you planted a tree. It wasn't a big deal. And there were three waves that really reclaimed the holiday. The first was in the Middle Ages in a community in Sfat, which is in the land of Israel. This became an opportunity for filling it with new concepts because Rosh Hashanah was taken and too busy, and Yom Kippur was busy. But Tu B'Shvat was available as something that maybe we can add some extra Kabbalistic Jewish mystical experience to. And so they began to create a Seder where you would eat certain foods in a certain order and drink wine in a certain order. So they had three kinds of fruits or nuts that you would eat. One is a kind that is hard on the outside but soft on the inside. Think a walnut, right, or an orange. The other is soft on the outside but hard on the inside, like an apple, right, or an apricot with a hard pit. And the third was the kind of fruit you can eat all the way through, like a fig, right? You can pick a fig off a tree and eat it all the way through. And these were emblematic of different styles of human personality. They also had 4 cups of wine, because just like the Passover Seder, you have 4 cups of wine. In this case, it was 4 cups of different colors. So you start with red wine, and then red with a little bit of white, and then white, and then red with a lot of white, or mostly white with a little bit of red, and then finally all white. So you have the different colors of wine reflecting the changing of the seasons and the passage of time and different aspects of divine emanation to the world and all kinds of creativity like that. Again, it was a niche idea of doing this kind of Passover Seder modeled in Tu B'Shvat around nuts and fruits instead of ritual foods like the Seder, and different cups of wine as opposed to just the same cup with different parts of the more extensive service. The second leap forward for Tu B'Shvat was the Zionist movement, because one of the major initiatives of Zionism was to purchase land in Israel and to plant trees. And if you were around in the 1930s, 40s, even into the 50s, you may remember a little box that would have lived on your mantle with a logo of the land of Israel. It was sometimes blue, sometimes green, and often had the letters JNF on it for Jewish National Fund. And you would collect money all year, and you would buy trees in Israel on Tu B'Shvat. And there's all these jokes about people who go to Israel and say, "Where's my tree? I want to find my tree that I paid for." And there's a very funny shtick in a movie called Salach Shabati about the early years of the state of Israel. This was made in like 61, 62. And this new immigrant is set to work planting trees. And the mover and shaker who's in charge of the initiative puts up a sign that says the Marvin Birnbaum Forest. And then a car pulls up, and Marvin and his family get out, and he says, "Mr. Birnbaum, this is your forest." And so Birnbaum comes over, and they all take a picture by the sign as people are planting, and then he gets in the car, and they drive off, and the man waves goodbye, and as soon as they cross over the hill, he runs over, takes down the sign, and puts up the sign for the Maurice Schwartz Forest. And then another car comes over the hill, and Maurice Schwartz gets out, and "Maurice Schwartz, this is your forest." So, whether you actually have a tree that is like a plaque on it or something, or a registry, is maybe less certain. So that was the second plus of adding something to Tu B'Shvat. But the third one that really made it take off was the Jewish environmental movement, which is really a reflection of the broader environmental movement. And as environmentalism took off in the 1990s in particular, Tu B'Shvat was seen as a great opportunity, sort of an empty vessel they could fill with new ideas. So now it's become a kind of Jewish Earth Day where you talk about recycling, you talk about reducing your use, you talk about the importance of trees and why they're valuable. And these are all ways of connecting the holiday to our current values of environmental stewardship and management. The rabbis who talked about the New Year's for trees didn't care about recycling. That wasn't their agenda. But it's our agenda that we project into the holiday to make it more relevant today. So now it's a staple for the Sunday school calendar. Many congregations will do even adult Tu B'Shvat Seders as well, again, often focused on that environmental theme because you're eating agricultural products directly. But I grew up in a humanistic congregation, you think is progressive, in the 1970s and 80s, and I have no recollection whatsoever of Tu B'Shvat. And it was only when I started teaching in Sunday schools in 96, 97, that we were doing Tu B'Shvat, and it was relatively new at the time. So this was one of those transitions in Jewish life, even in the last 30, 40 years, that have changed how holidays are celebrated. Now, there is one other fertility-ish holiday that, again, might have had a fertility echo before, but we don't really have much of a resonance of that, and that is a holiday called Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is the beginning of the new moon, and therefore the beginning of the new month. Remember, Rosh is head, like Rosh Hashanah, so Rosh Chodesh is the beginning of the new month, but remember, Chodesh is month, Chadash is new, so it's really the beginning of the new moon. Same root for the word. And women have a special perk on that day. They are allowed to not work. One day a month. Well, in theory on Shabbat too, but they do a heck of a lot of work preparing for it. But it's seen as a special holiday for women. and a chance to partake of a ritual called Kiddush HaLevana, the sanctifying of the moon. And you have a special blessing. You go out into the nature and you look up and see the moon. And actually, you're allowed to do this blessing anytime between the first of the month and I think 2 weeks almost into the month, because what if it's cloudy on the first of the month and you can't see the moon? You have to actually see the moon. So you go out sometime, usually in the first few days, and you see the moon, and you print you actually print the blessing on a special card that has extra big letters, and it's a font called Rosh Chodesh letters because they're extra big to be able to see outside in dim light. And you say the blessing to sanctify the moon. And sometimes people are fasting and penitent before Rosh Chodesh because it's seen as a kind of mini Yom Kippur. If Rosh Hashanah, the turning of the sun year, is a time of judgment, then maybe the turning of the moon cycle is thought to be a kind of mini Yom Kippur as well. And this was an idea created also in Tzfat in the mystical circles by Moses Cordovero around the 16th century. Again, Rosh Chodesh was a relatively minor observance for a long time, as much of women's culture was, again, in a male-dominated society. But it has been reclaimed in recent decades by Jewish feminists and Jewish women who see this as, again, a uniquely marked holiday that is an opportunity to create new meaning. And so now you have Rosh Chodesh groups where women get together and whether they discuss issues or have rituals or go out into nature, it's become a connection. It has nothing to do with their physical cycles, although, of course, the moon as a symbol for the woman's cycle is, again, a universal fertility connection. But it's an opportunity for taking the holiday and adding new meaning to it in a modern context. So that's a quick overview of Tu B'Shvat and Rosh Chodesh as fertility festivals, and we also had a chance to talk more about Hanukkah as a end of the light cycle festival.
Well, I would say my wife every used to work at a newborn nursery, and it seemed that more babies would be born on the full moon.
More babies are born on the full moon. Well, I'm sure that's something you could statistically check. I mean, there are records of births, and you can follow the moon cycle and figure it out. That would be interesting to check. I wonder if that's not like selective memory.
Well, she would try to avoid working on the full moon because the nursery would be more
busy.
Busy. Everybody would be crazy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the moon controls the tides. Maybe it controls the contractions too. I don't know.
Yeah, and what about the town of Tzfat? There is still a town of Tzfat, isn't there? Is it still a very religious or mystical kind of?
Yes, a very religious community. It has a lot of Jewish mystics who live there. There's also an artist colony there. You can get really beautiful artwork that's done there. But often there's sort of an overlap. The art is sort of mystically inclined artworks, mandalas and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely worth a visit. It's in the north, so it's a very scenic territory. And I don't think I've ever been there, actually, in my trips to Israel. I've been near there, but I haven't been to Tzfat directly.
I seem to remember a song, Nime Tzfat. I'm from Tzfat. A woman, what is it? Was that a religious or was that a secular song?
I don't know. I don't know that one off the top of my head. I'd have to look. But again, most of these songs, well, I don't know. My guess is it's just a general song. There are a lot of geographic songs from the early period of Israeli music because they were sort of introducing people to the country. So they'll talk about walking in this part of the town. Or, a famous one is called Halichala Caesarea, Walking to Caesarea, which we know of as Eli Eli, but the official title is Walking to Caesarea. So it may have been part of that geographic song period. But I don't know the song directly. I'd have to look it up.